So it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Mills. I'm Luke Rickert. I'm on the organizing committee, a professor in the School of Pharmacy, and I've known Jim for, I guess going on 8, 10 years now. And the thing you should know about him is, of all the things you should know about him, that he's from Glasgow. He's flown here from Glasgow, Scotland, to give us a talk today, and that's the key thing. So maybe there's going to be a bit of jet lag, maybe not. I'm not sure, but so Jim Mills, who has led the Center for the Social History of Health and Healthcare at the University of Strathclyde, is now Director of Research within the Health and Humanities at Strathclyde University. He's been the PI or the co-PI on multiple Wellcome Trust grants, administering over $5 million, £5 million to shepherd historical, sociological, and anthropological research around various psychoactive substances and plants, including cannabis. And so he has a background in the poppy, which was been already raised, background in cannabis. He's one of the leading figures in the history of cannabis and its intersection with colonialism and psychiatry. Really landmark books in the history of cannabis, including Cannabis Nation and Cannabis Britannica, which speak a lot about empire and the ways in which empires are formed and the ways in which plants, particularly cannabis and poppy, are controlled within those empires. He's the author of multiple articles in addition to these books, and the list is too long really to read. I'm going to turn it over to Jim right now, and there's going to be time for Q&A as well. So if there is questions following his talk, please go up to the microphone. And in addition to going up to the microphone, maybe just say who you are. Just let us know where you're coming from, maybe your unit on campus, and then I think we'll sort of follow along with that pattern with the other Q&A sessions afterwards too. So Jim, I'm turning over to you.
Good morning. I've learned over the years that keynote speaker is really just a fancy term for warm-up act. So I'm very conscious that my job over the next half an hour or so is to get you interested and excited about the rest of the day's events, something that an academic historian is not used to trying to do. I've been looking forward to this event since Luke first invited me, as I suspect that such a multidisciplinary group will provide all sorts of answers to questions that have been occurring to me about cannabis really over the last 2 years, and I'll explain why the last 2 years in a moment. So I should therefore start by saying thanks to Luke, to the School of Pharmacy here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also to the organisers of this great event today, to the UW Cannabis Research Conference, for asking me to fly in from Glasgow, where the weather's just as bad as it is here. Now, I'll start by a confession, one that I've just touched on. I'm a historian, and I've considered cannabis and its products to be a matter for historical inquiry, really for over the last 3 decades. I stumbled upon them as an issue in the archives of the colonial government in India while researching my PhD way back in the 1990s. I've been researching them ever since, producing books and articles on the history of both the control and consumption of cannabis substances, mainly in Britain and its former colonies in Asia and Africa, but more recently in a global framework. Right, so what I'll do is I'll break the next half an hour up into these kind of 3 sections. I'm halfway through the introduction, which is a good job I remembered to put this slide up. And then what I'll do is I'll talk about my current role in the Scottish Parliament and a little bit more about the history and what many people are calling the cannabis revolution for the last 25 years. But I felt I ought to prove that I am a historian of cannabis and establish my credentials, which is why I put these four colourful books together. I've never done this before. I only did this morning. And when you do this as a historian, you shouldn't realise that most of your career is behind you. So I don't know whether to be excited or depressed about this. So if I seem to go between the two states over the next half an hour, you'll know why. It's because I see my career before me and also behind me. I'll talk you through them, if you forgive me. Madness, Cannabis and Colonialism. That was the outcome of this PhD research published back in the year 2000. The cannabis in the title was really the publisher's decision, as there's only actually a chapter in the book that deals with cannabis. But of course, the wisdom of the old publisher that I was dealing with immediately prevailed. He realised that cannabis would help sell the book. It was an important chapter, I think, though, because what I demonstrated was that in British India in the 19th century, the wider thesis was asking the question, why did these British colonisers, if they're simply out in Asia to exploit and extract, why did they build a system of psychiatric hospitals in 19th century India? If you want to answer, buy the book. But what I've noticed was that the record-keeping systems of the hospitals that they established began to generate a number. And the number demonstrated that the majority of admissions, Indian admissions from the local community to these colonial hospitals were down to mental health problems caused by cannabis. And indeed, this was one of the first times, if not the first time, that a statistic was generated which demonstrated a causal link between cannabis consumption and mental illness. But the statistic was a fake one, because what was happening was that doctors and magistrates, the police officers who were often finding people on the streets, were linking cannabis consumption to mental illness rather than demonstrating it. And the process was more or less as follows. The superintendent of the hospital would be presented, usually with a potential patient, by the police or through the courts. And these people had been snarled up in the system because their behaviour had been disorderly or a threat to the peace. The superintendent was British, and usually in this period Scottish, and would be entirely baffled by everything that was going on around him, let alone with the question of what had caused this potential patient's mental illness. But he had a form to fill in, and he had a box in the top of the form which asked cause of mental illness. And being a British coloniser, he had to fill that form in. That was his job. So he would ask the magistrate or the police officer, what do you think's caused this? Is it alcohol? Now, alcohol was the chief cause of mental illness back in the UK. So this was commonly linked with mental illness episodes. And the Indian police officer or the magistrate would turn around and say, no, sir, we don't drink alcohol around here. Because of large parts of North India, which was where my study was based, alcohol is consumed in Indian society, but not to any great extent. So the superintendent would then ask, well, what do you use? Cannabis, because cannabis had been used medicinally and therapeutically and recreationally for from thousands, hundreds if not thousands of years in North India. So the superintendent would simply write down Indian hemp, which was the name that they used at the time for cannabis. Over time, of course, at the end of the year, when the superintendent would write his report, the report would note, once he counted all the counting up, 40% of cases seem to be linked to cannabis. This might be an interesting story from a long forgotten place and period, but hang on. It was this statistic that generated the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission in the 1890s, which began to drive policy in the 20th century on cannabis. It remains the largest single investigation into a cannabis-consuming society to date. It's all 8 volumes, and I've read every single word of those bloody 8 volumes. So what you see is here a statistic which was discredited by the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission itself. A statistic generated policy which has its origin, which in many ways is the origins of the policy problems we're confronting today. Cannabis Botanica played on this theme. I went back in and thought, hang on, there's more to this cannabis story than meets the eye. So really, Cannabis Botanica took the story from about 1800, the start of the British Empire in India, through to 1928, when the UK got its first cannabis regulations. The kind of, if you like, the punchline to the second book was that the UK got cannabis regulations long before it had any cannabis consumers. And it found itself in this position, controlled before consumption, because of international treaty regulations. Cannabis became snarled up in the politics of opium in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which explains why the 1925 Geneva Opium Commission, why it deals with cannabis, not just opium. Cannabis Nation took the story right up until 2008, looking at the way in which the UK had become tangled up on the issue of cannabis. And then, of course, Cannabis Global Histories contained almost none of my work, which is its chief merit. Luke and I ran a conference in Glasgow way back in 2018, I guess it was, Luke. And this was a collection of papers. The reason I mention this is because I think it's the best of all of my work, mainly because there's very little of it in there. But it shows, I think, the way in which historians, anthropologists, sociologists are starting to try and think about the problem of cannabis and cannabis policy beyond state and national borders, and trying to think of it as a global process and a global problem. Right, are you convinced I'm a historian? Good. Now, in August 2024, I was appointed as Secretary to the Cross-Party Group for Medicinal Cannabis in the Scottish Parliament. So I'll refer to this as the CPG from now on, the Cross-Party Group for Medicinal Cannabis in the Scottish Parliament. So much of my paper today reflects the uncertainty of a career historian suddenly required to engage with the present, and worse still, to try to anticipate the future. It is very much uncharted territory to find myself concerned with contemporary issues. So I hope you'll bear with me while I begin to trace how a knowledge of the past might enable us to untangle current problems. Or at the very least, it might enable us to take notice of where we find ourselves after a quarter century of what many have called the cannabis revolution. So, you remember I had a second section which I called the CPG, Cole Thompson and Resistance to the Cannabis Revolution. The good news is we're there. The CPG, our cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament, was formed in 2021 with the aim of securing wider access to legal cannabis medicines in Scotland. Since 2018 in the UK, it has been possible for those suffering from a number of conditions to be prescribed cannabis medicines by medical specialists. I'm going to get a bit technical, but bear with me, follow me through. The medical specialists have to be trained to deal with those conditions. There. So for those of you bored of listening to me, you can learn all of the conditions for which certain cannabis medicines are available legally in the UK. So there's our Scottish cross-party group, the CPG. I'll talk you through some of the rest of it now. Okay, so products considered legal are those that meet a pharmaceutical standard called Good Manufacturing Practice in the UK, GMP. Now, this is to make sure that they pass safety standards and contain the right chemical ingredients. However, the National Health Service, the NHS, which I'm sure most of you will have heard of, which provides healthcare for all UK citizens, the NHS guidance, after this legalisation of certain medicines in 2018, the NHS added guidance, making clear that cannabis-based products for medicinal use, I'll refer to those as CBPMs, right, from now on. These CBPMs are not routinely commissioned. So already we've got a law, or change in the law, which makes certain cannabis-based medicines legally accessible, almost straight away. Right? Guidance from a range of bodies began to crowd that in, began to limit that. So the NHS was already making clear that cannabis products for medicinal use were not routinely to be prescribed. The NHS also made clear that it will only pay for medicines that are licensed in the UK and which treat severe epilepsy, chronic pain and vomiting associated with chemotherapy. So not all of these. A very limited set of conditions is something the NHS would pay for. and again, without trying to explain the NHS to everybody here, the NHS essentially, I'll come on to this in a bit more detail in a moment, essentially is obliged to pay for all medicines for UK citizens that are legal and licensed. But I made clear in this instance, they would only pay for those which were licensed and legal. Stick with me. In practice, this meant that patients can only access Sativex and Epidiolex on the NHS, and all other medical products which are past the GMP test, so they're good stuff, they're okay, they're legal, but the NHS will not pay for them because they're not licensed. So the only products in the UK based on cannabis which are licensed are Sativex and Epidiolex and kind of Nabilone in brackets. So treatment for all these other conditions and using all other cannabis-based products for medicinal use must therefore be secured through private prescriptions. So again, without boring you too much with the way the UK organises its healthcare, you can pay for a private prescription, and then once you pay for the private prescription from a specialist in this case, you then need to pay for the dispensing costs, and you also need to pay for the product itself, all from your own resources. So, right, so far so boring. So, how does this play out for patients and their carers? Well, the process starts by requiring patients or their carers to demonstrate that they have been prescribed and have tried all other alternative painkillers or treatments, and that these have all failed, so that there is what the authorities call an unmet clinical need. So we've tried, you have to try everything else, no matter how unpleasant and some of these treatments can be for severe pain and severe epilepsy and so on. You've got to try them all and then demonstrate that despite having tried everything that's available on the market, your condition's as bad as ever, you're suffering chronic pain, the seizures are as regular and as severe as before. Therefore, it's time to turn to the CBPMs, the cannabis-based medicines. These individuals must then be assessed by those classified as specialists in those conditions by the General Medical Council in one of the medical fields listed. So typically pain specialists, oncologists and neurologists. So you don't just go to your local doctor or you don't go to the general practitioner around the corner. You must seek out and find, then contact, then arrange an appointment with a specialist. These doctors will then decide if there is indeed a case for prescribing legal cannabis medicines for the unmet clinical need. And once they have done so, a prescription is provided. And unless it is for one of those licensed medicines, Sativex or Epidiolex, the prescription costs, dispensing costs, price of the product, all come down to the patient or their carers. So in other words, cannabis medicines are now legal in the UK, but access to them is strictly controlled. So the CPG was first established back in 2021 because it had become clear that the system was a hindrance to its supposed objectives, the relief of chronic pain or severe epilepsy through cannabis medicines. In practice, these specialists were often reluctant to prescribe cannabis products because most were yet to be licensed by the relevant authorities. Basically, if you prescribe an unlicensed medicine and something goes wrong, the book comes back to you. Whereas if you, as a prescriber, if you prescribe a licensed medicine, the book goes back to the NHS, who then sue the producer. So to be a specialist prescribing a cannabis-based medicine, you've got to be fairly certain that cannabis-based medicine is going to do no harm at all. Otherwise, you will be the subject of litigation. This meant that I've done that bit. It appears that, as of this year, less than 10% of prescriptions have been made using the NHS. So the vast majority have been made through private prescription. Indeed, a number of pharmacist companies have started offering online consultations, specifically to provide CBPMs. Now, I've flashed this up just to demonstrate that I'm not making this stuff up, but also bear in mind the image compared to the marketing image, compared to the image that I'm about to show you. So, and what's interesting is that the specialists, these companies put patients in touch with the specialists, and the specialists seem to cheerfully prescribe cannabis medicines. And I don't know quite how this works yet. There's a bit more research to be done. But my guess is that these companies are promising the specialists that they will cover the costs of any litigation, which is making the specialists bolder in their prescriptions. Now, how this all works in practice is made clear in the case of Cole Thompson. Bear in mind that image, and then have a look at this one. Cole has a rare form of severe epilepsy, which can cause up to 20 seizures in a day. Now, through a system of trial and error since he was an infant, his mother, Lisa Cole, so there's Cole, and then there's Lisa, his mum, and his brother. Through a system of trial and error since he was an infant, his mother, Lisa, established that Bedrolite was the only product that seemed to significantly reduce both the frequency and the severity of his seizures. Regular treatment over the years has enabled him to make it to the age of 13, to attend school with support, and even to enjoy taekwondo lessons, which is Cole at the bottom there. Bedrolite, of course, is the brand name for the cultivar Cannabis sativa redencina. Cannabis sativa redencina is a so-called CBD-only product with less than 1% THC and 9% CBD. Due to the extremely low levels of THC, its producers claim it has no psychoactive or intoxicating properties. The problem is, of course, that Bedrolite is one of those products which is now legal in the UK, but not licensed. This means that Lisa can secure a prescription for the substance. She's found a specialist who's willing to take on the risk of writing one out on a monthly basis. But it falls on her to secure a regular supply and to pay for it. This requires her to find around $3,000 a month, which is impossible as a working single parent with a family. Her argument over the last 6 years has been that Bedrolite has proven to be the only effective medicine for her son over a sustained period, and therefore the National Health Service ought to be providing the resources to meet his requirements. They should be paying for this. After all, the Act of 1948 that established the NHS explicitly states that it should be comprehensive, free of charge, and available to everyone equally for the improvement of physical and mental health. But so far the authorities have refused to budge. The NHS in Scotland has stated that it has every sympathy with the case, but that it does not fund unlicensed medicines. The Scottish Medicines Consortium has stated that it will not license the product until it passes strict requirements for all new medicines that include double-blind trials. Successive Cabinet Secretaries for Health and Social Care in Scotland have tried to argue that access to cannabis medicines is a matter for the UK Parliament in London and not for the Scottish Government, which is nebulous at best, it's politician stuff. The CPG invited me to take on the role of Secretary because I argued that these positions were as much an outcome of the history of cannabis in Britain, and particularly in Scotland, as they were the results of medical or scientific processes. Right, how did I argue that, and why did they buy it? In the first place, I pointed to the lingering mistrust of cannabis that echoes in contemporary discussions of cannabis medicines in the UK. For example, Dr. Wendy Holden, who's a British consultant, rheumatologist and pain management specialist, reported that when she first began to conduct trials with cannabis medicines a decade ago, colleagues warned her that it was a gateway drug likely to lead to other addictions in patients. Now, my work has shown that the idea that cannabis is a suspicious and mysterious plant which cannot be trusted was first established by Europeans in colonial contexts in Asia and Africa. Local use for medicinal and recreational purposes stretch back hundreds and thousands of years in these places, but its association with the colonised and their unfamiliar customs meant that it has long been seen as an alien substance in British medicine. You don't believe me? Have a look at this. Whitelaw Ainsley. Whitelaw Ainsley was a Scots doctor working out in India in the 1810s and the 1820s. And he wrote the first materia medica in English of medicines that were being used across South Asia that he'd encountered during his career. His first edition came out in 1813 with a brief mention of cannabis products and cannabis substances that he'd observed in medical use. But then in 1826, when he expanded his book into 2 volumes, we got a much larger consideration of cannabis preparations. But he was very clear. Cannabis would seem, however, to be applied to very different purposes in eastern countries from those for which it is resorted to in colder territories, being chiefly employed in the former for its inebriating and narcotic qualities. Now, there's plenty of statements throughout the last 2 centuries which echo this. But here we have, if you like, the foundational statement on cannabis medicines by a British doctor who had actually seen them in use, dismissed. Dismissed as simply a dangerous, the cannabis plant was dismissed as a source of intoxication. So, from the outset of the British relationship with cannabis, doctors have seen it as a source of intoxication rather than therapy. The current problem, or the current problems that Lisa is experiencing in NHS access to cannabis medicines also reflects the UK's regulatory history on powerful psychoactive medicines. When cannabis first emerged as a social and political problem in the UK during the 1960s, the governments of the period quickly learned that issues related to the control of consumption were complex and fraught with political danger. In trying to draft legislation for cannabis controls, the legislators got stuck. They got stuck on the issue of how much cannabis an individual could have in their possession for personal use, and how much should be interpreted as evidence of intent to supply. So in other words, I've been arrested, I've got some cannabis on me. How much cannabis should can I have to persuade a court that it's just for personal use? Look, I'm going home, I'm going to have a toke. Well, how much do I have on me before the police officers and the magistrates are persuaded, actually, I'm going down the pub to sell this stuff, I'm a dealer. So, when they were trying to write the legislation, well, when the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, which is the kind of foundation of all UK drugs law to this day, when the 1971 Act was passed, the legislators had failed to resolve the issue. Instead, their advice was that when cases came to court, it was for magistrates or judges to decide what possession indicated, given the context of each case. Now, what happened in practice after that is that those judges or magistrates turned to police officers for their advice in court, so that the latter now found themselves put on the spot to address a policy problem on the hoof. Put simply, government officials and legislators removed themselves from cannabis policy over half a century ago in the UK, turning it over to the courts and then ultimately to enforcement agents. Officials and legislators have been keen to remain at a distance from cannabis issues ever since. Maybe Lisa's talking to the wrong people. She shouldn't be talking to the policymakers who don't want anything to do with cannabis. I might add that I suspect a Scottish history here too. Cannabis was officially declared to be obsolete as a source of medicines by the WHO in 1952, and in practice had fallen out of use in Britain at least 30 years prior to that. In Britain, cannabis products were therefore seen largely as a source of pleasure, reckless or perhaps even dangerous pleasure, from the 1950s through to the 1990s. So in other words, in the cultural and popular imagination, cannabis really wasn't seen as a source of medicines for most of the late part of the 20th century in Britain. It was seen as a dangerous source of pleasure and intoxication. Of course, there is a Presbyterian streak in parts of Scottish culture which regards pleasure with suspicion and reckless pleasure as a sure path to hell. When I argue to Scottish audiences, bearing in mind that I'm English, when I argue to Scottish audiences that this explains why there is resistance to greater access to cannabis medicines in Scotland in the 2020s, I pretend that I'm teasing them. Here, I can confess that I'm sure that I'm onto something in such an observation. Now, it is my contention then that history, not science or policy, explains why those suffering from chronic pain and severe epilepsy in Scotland are still experiencing difficulties in securing access to effective legal cannabis medicines through the NHS. Current attitudes and approaches reflect long-held prejudices and are wrapped up in systems warped by concerns and situations now long lost in the mists of time. Except to historians, of course. That's what we do. I hope that the more often historians point this out, the more likely it is that the authorities in Scotland will realise that they can break free of the past and ensure that social justice prevails, so that it is not only those who can afford to pay for their prescriptions in the UK who can access the benefits of legal cannabis medicines. Now, at the start of the paper, I promised to trace how a knowledge of the past might enable us to untangle current problems, and I hope I've addressed that so far. I think I've got 2 minutes left. Luke, do you reckon? I also stated that a knowledge of the past can position us to take notice of where we find ourselves after a quarter of a century of what many have called the cannabis revolution. I've got 2 minutes to do that. And 2 sides of paper, all right, so don't panic. After all, many of you may be thinking, well, that's a good story, but so what? It may be bad news for the Scots, but here in the US, we are in the vanguard of the so-called cannabis revolution. Now, what I've told you may seem like an interesting tale from charming and faraway places, but I think it is of wider significance because of what it points to. It points to the phrase I used in the title of this talk, well done to anybody who can remember it, resistance to the cannabis revolution. I guess we are all here today because of the remarkable changes in attitudes and approaches to cannabis of the last 25 years or so. Changes in approaches and attitudes which many have been calling the cannabis revolution, a term I don't have time to tackle today. But when we look at the global picture, resistance is as common as revolution at this moment in time around the world. 25% of those incarcerated during Duterte's war on drugs in the Philippines were cannabis consumers. China recently enhanced controls on CBD products to make them impossible to access legally. Here in Wisconsin, of course, Madison is the only jurisdiction with full decriminalisation of marijuana possession, and even that's only up to a point. And medical use is limited to CBD-only products on prescription from a doctor. If the revolution therefore seems to be unevenly spaced geographically, it is also something that may have historical antecedents. 200 years ago, and despite the misgivings of Whitelaw Ainsley, who I mentioned earlier, cannabis enjoyed a brief moment as a wonder drug in 19th century medicine, thanks to entrepreneurs like William Brooke O'Shaughnessy. And the delight of that sketch is, it's actually a contemporary sketch. So somebody's watched him in his lab and sketched that out at the time. So that's what WB looked like in action 200 years ago. Now, he was a savvy Irishman who trained in Scotland and joined the Indian Medical Service, the medical arm of the British colonial state in India. By the late 1830s, he was Professor of Chemistry and Medicine in the Medical College of Calcutta, where he started conducting trials with various cannabis preparations. Preparations that he had acquired in the city's large local marketplaces. So even today, you wander around a bazaar in India, they'll be selling everything that you could possibly want, but there'll be a large section in one corner dealing entirely with medicinal substances and medicinal preparations, often in their raw states. So if you turn up and you say, oh, I've got a headache or I've got jet lag, the druggist there will pick some of that out, will give it a good bash together, drop some alcohol in it for you, and you take it. Always sorts me out. Always sorts out my jet lag. I've never quite worked out what's in it though. So he experimented with these cannabis products in his lab. He experimented on fish, birds, cats, dogs, goats, and that lowest of all animals, medical students, before writing a series of papers about cannabis. He launched his research findings on the plant to a delighted audience in London at the start of the 1840s. 100 years, oh, I've lost a little bit here. And essentially, cannabis enjoyed that moment as a wonder drug of Victorian medicine. There was a specially arranged meeting of the society that became the British Medical Association, which devoted a whole evening to O'Shaughnessy's research on cannabis medicines. You can track this through the British Medical Journal and other medical journals of the period through the 1840s. Doctors around the UK and subsequently around the world started using cannabis to try and treat everything, from vomiting, treating pain, and dealing with the agonies of giving birth, nymphomania, oddly enough, at some point as well. So you can track this through the 1840s and the 1850s, that cannabis becomes this wonder drug. The cannabis revolution, if you like, of the 19th century takes place between about 1840 and about 1880, but it fizzles out. And it fizzles out because, for various reasons, pharmacologists failed to extract any of the active ingredients from cannabis during this period. So compared to opium during this time, where morphine had been extracted and codeine had been extracted right at the beginning of the 19th century, it meant that cannabis remained a kind of difficult substance to use, partly because it had psychoactive side effects. So you were never too sure what that lump of organic cannabis was going to do to your patients, whether it was going to relieve their pain or their nausea or induce sleep, or whether it was going to make them hysterical and disconcerted through the use of these substances. Now, if we're taking a walk back in time, we've gone back 200 years to a cannabis revolution that fizzled out. But if we go back 100 years, well, in 1925 was the year of the Geneva Opium Convention that I mentioned, in which cannabis was controlled on an international scale for the first time. Fast forward to the moment today, and here we are once again in the middle of a cannabis revolution, where it seems that regulations giving way, attitudes and approaches are changing at a rapid pace, and so on. So, if we look not just at a geographical context for our cannabis revolution of the moment, but also at a historical context, we see a slightly more complicated story about what the cannabis revolution may or may not be. And I'm not sure I would like to predict what our successors will be saying a century from now about our current excitement. My point, if we are to understand the cannabis revolution of the last quarter century, and perhaps to anticipate its global futures, we need to make sure we pay greater attention to regional, national, and even local histories of the ways people around the world are trying to understand cannabis and its products today. Thank you. It says here, for assistance call. Shall I call them? Or are we going to be all right for the next 10 minutes?
Hi, thank you for coming, first of all, and for the great talk. I've got a couple kids, and one of them has epilepsy and autism. So first of all, I want to thank you for advocating for those kids out there. On the other hand, I have a daughter who uses it recreationally, and I bring all of this up because I think it underscores, as you said, the complexity of the topic. And so she started out, using, sort of weed in the traditional sense, and had some respiratory effects, but other than that was fine. And I think it helped her with her depression and stuff like that. But then eventually she got on to using like honey or wax, which I understand, I'm not an expert, but is extremely concentrated. And we've seen in the States here, kids ending up in emergency rooms because of use of this. And my daughter had like this period of psychosis after that. Since then, I stopped using that, went back to the more traditional weed, and has been fine, I think. So anyway, I was just curious on your thoughts as a historian and someone who deals with policy. It's such a complicated issue, and it seems like there's such a spectrum of different products under the cannabis umbrella. And how do we talk about that so that kids who need it can use it, but that kids don't end up in the emergency room using the wrong type of product?
Do you know, it's an interesting question, and as a historian I can only answer it kind of historically, but this has been the case for the last 250 years as Western societies have engaged with cannabis using societies. These are problems that have, I would argue, have yet to find answers, because those of us who have worked with cannabis for a long time will know that it's a powerful and a complex substance, and it will inevitably affect individuals in slightly different ways because of each of us has an individual body, which means it has an individual endocannabinoid system, with all of its quirks, and like all of our bodies, we've all got the same basic equipment, but with all their complexities and varieties that we have to thank our parents and our ancestors for. So I guess the way to kind of start the conversation, or to insert ourselves as a group into the conversation about the cannabis revolution now, is to kind of insist that everybody faces that fact and kind of repeats it before they enter rooms or labs or cabinet offices and so on. That this is a complex substance, it's a complex plant, a whole range of products can be made out of this, but there's a big range of products there being used for all sorts of reasons, and some of those reasons might be harmful or might be viewed as harmful. And I think, and part of the reason I think historians have got something to say that's useful here is because we are now 25 years into this cannabis revolution. And my impression lingers that at the moment, everybody's so excited about the potential of cannabis products that those who are trying to insist on notes of caution, just by pointing to the complexity of this substance when it comes to human bodies, they're kind of getting drowned out or being kind of boo-hiss, you're boring. So I kind of, I think as a historian, my job is to continue pointing backwards and saying, look, we've been through all of this for the last 2.5 centuries, and nobody's yet come up with the answer. I've spent more years than I ought to have done reading long-lost committee reports and long-lost committee minutes where exactly the same conversations happened 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, or 175 years ago. So I suppose, the short answer to your question is we need to make sure that we keep making notes of the complexities of cannabis substances.
Do we have to use the mic to ask a question?
No, just shout.
Can only take one more question, and then you are here through the day,
yeah,
correct?
just come find me.
should
Yeah,
continue
yeah,
to
so-
pitch, but
Well, historically, you're the expert, and so curious about how research in like the Middle East, and I'm not sure, but I think isn't that more the hub of cannabis research and where it's really allowed and the monies are flowing somewhere, and I don't know what the country is, but is like historically if that research is based there, do you know where it comes from? I mean, that it's where the dollars are being poured on a international level to one research hub. Am I speaking, if anyone else knows the answer?
I must say I've not, it doesn't immediately ring a bell, but the connection I do make, of course, is that it was Israeli scientists who were researching cannabis back in the 50s. Unlike scientists, in most other places who found cannabis research not just difficult to fund, but difficult to get permission for. And also it was uncool back in the 50s. Everybody was excited by synthetic medicines. So, but interestingly, it was Israeli doctors and who were conducting this research, which eventually led to the kind of discovery, if you like, of the endocannabinoid system and an understanding of the initial isolation of THC took place in Israeli labs. And it's been argued that's because Israeli pharmaceutical research at the time was badly funded, and there's a lot of cannabis around in the Middle East. So the pharmacologists in the lab became interested in what is essentially hashish and hashish use in local communities, and they've noticed that hashish wasn't just being used for recreational purposes. It was part of Arabic medicine, it was part of folk medicine, and so on. So they kind of sat down and went back through the historical material. I haven't got the time.
no, you're good. You
sure?
two minutes. I was off.
Essentially, Western doctors and pharmacologists gave up on trying to isolate the active ingredients in cannabis in the late 1890s because there was a lab in Cambridge which exploded. And there's a suspicion that the reason that the lab exploded, where they were trying to isolate THC, and not they knew that it was THC, but there's a suspicion that they'd also been having the long hours of watching all this stuff bubble up may have impaired their judgment. And somebody dozed off. And the whole lab exploded and killed one of the research scientists. So the university closed the research down. Nobody went anywhere near it again for 60 or 70 years. So in Israel, what happened? I'm forgetting his name. What's his name, Luke? That's exactly it. So he latched on it because he didn't have money to fund anything else, and was kind of aware that nobody had ever solved this puzzle way back in the 19th century. So decided, right, let's see if we can solve this puzzle. It was more of an intellectual project for him rather than anything more important. But that was the moment where that's where THC was first isolated, and it then became a kind of established research program. So I think it was Israeli doctors as well who were key to kind of discovering the identifying the endocannabinoid system. Done.
No, that's okay. It's exactly 10. Good, thank you.